Hi, this is Keith Hall. Welcome to Economics 590, the federal budget process. This is our first video on government spending around the world. In particular, in this video, we want to mention anyway the 6 economic functions of government. Those are things I think you've already seen before. Then we want to briefly look at historical trends in government spending, tax revenue, and government borrowing by the major economies of the world, and then, of course, how the U.S. compares to those other countries. This slide shows the 6 economic functions of government: maintain the legal and social framework, maintain competition, provide public goods and services, correct for market externalities, stabilize the economy, redistribute income. In particular, what's happened during the pandemic years, we had a real surge in federal spending and state and local spending as well. And a full 58% of total government spending during the pandemic year was redistributing income rather than providing government services. And this, of course, was primarily according to age and income level. Looking at historical trends, first, the role and size of governments around the world has changed drastically in the last couple of centuries. In early industrialized countries, public spending increased sharply and increased resources towards social protection, education, and healthcare. Spending in high-income countries tends to be larger and more focused on social protection than other countries. Here's a graph that shows the U.S. government expenditures as a share of GDP from 1800 to 2010. And you'll see a really clear, interesting pattern here. If you look at starting at 1800, government spending as a share of GDP was only 3 or 4%. And as you go along, we see these spikes. That's the War of 1812. That's the Civil War. This is World War I. This is World War II. You see Vietnam. You see the Great Recession here. But also you see this trend, this broad trend rising, increased government spending from around World War II, maybe a little before World War II till now, with a steady trend upwards. And now you see that the U.S. government expenditures as a share of GDP is up somewhere around 4%. And here's a breakout of total government expenditures by major function. This graph shows the time period 1900 to 2020. It's, again, it's spending as a share of GDP. Let's sort of work backwards here. If you look at the red area here, that's federal spending on pensions. Here is federal spending on healthcare in green. Here's federal spending on education. And you notice for, at least on pensions and healthcare, government spending started at about 0 in the mid-1950s and now has grown to be a significant part of government spending and the role of government. And you see a big growth in spending on education as well. This yellow area, if you take a little time to look at this, is defense spending. That's always been a major chunk. Of course, you see those spikes for World War II and World War I, etc. And then there's spending on welfare type of spending at the top. That's been a part of government spending for longer than some of these other. Okay. Now here's a comparison of government spending as a share of GDP among the G7 countries. I picked out the G7 countries because these are literally the 7 largest economies right now. And you'll see the United States here. And then you'll see this consistent pattern from all the G7 countries. And like the United States, they've all significantly increased government spending as a share of GDP. So it's been a worldwide change in the role of government, at least for the 7 major economies. And of course, you'll see some outliers here, like France and the UK and some other outliers. But right now, all the seven major economies are spending, over 35%, 35 to 45% of GDP in government spending. And government debt among the G7 countries. This is how much these individual countries have spent beyond what they've taken in revenues. And you'll see a real pattern of countries borrowing. If countries had constrained themselves to spend what they took in revenues, then government debt would have been zero. Instead, government debt now has been accumulating in all these countries, some countries faster than others, as they just haven't paid their bills. They've collected revenues that fall far short of expenditures. You see outliers here. You'll see this, for example, is Japan. Japan's often cited as being the biggest outlier in spending beyond their revenues. But the United States is also pretty high in this group. Now, to look at a snapshot, here is government spending by the top 30 major economies. And it's a snapshot. It's around 2019. For a couple of these countries, it's 2018 because of data availability. But I wanted to show you how the United States compares in government spending as a share of GDP to the 30 other major economies. And you'll see the government spending is in the lower half anyway. And if you take some time and look at this, you'll see some of these countries have chosen to spend a far larger share of GDP in the government sector. France and Ireland and some of these other countries. And then you also see government revenue. Even though government revenues generally lag behind spending, government revenue has varied a bit. The United States is, once again, sort of near the bottom compared to the other 30 economies. And you've got some economies here, if you look at them, that have a very much larger share of government revenues as a share of GDP. Then we have deficits. This is not accumulated debt, but this is year-to-year deficits. So 2019 is an interesting year to look at because in 2019, the global economy was doing pretty well. The United States had relatively strong growth. The world had relatively strong growth. Yet the United States did not raise revenue to match spending. They continued to borrow really significantly. In fact, that's a really high level of borrowing for such a decently performing economy. And you notice that a good chunk of the major economies went in surplus. Their revenues grew and their spending went down so that they actually had higher revenue than spending during that year. If you look, for example, at Norway at the top here, they ran a pretty significant surplus that year, as opposed to the United States, which didn't. Then we have accumulated debt. This is not just year-to-year deficits. This is accumulated debt, how much government owes as a share of GDP. The United States is near the top. This graph shows the United States at roughly 100%. Accumulated debt's about the same size as GDP. Now it's gone significantly higher than that. And of course, you see some other countries have higher debt. There's the Japan outlier that we talked about with respect to deficits. Well, of course, their accumulated debt was higher. And part of the snapshot, let's look at 2020. That's beyond that 2019 snapshot. In 2020, during the pandemic year, total government spending in the United States was about $9.1 trillion. Far higher spending than any other year in the past. We have an economy that's $21 trillion. So $9 trillion in spending out of a $21 trillion economy is really high. Spending is 44% of GDP. And that spending was about $27,650 per person. And how was that paid for? Well, receipts were about $5.8 trillion. So a rather large part of it was paid for by government borrowing. Government borrowed something to the tune of $3.3 trillion in 2020, which is by far the record level of borrowing by the US government. Almost double the previous record of borrowing. The previous record of borrowing occurred during the Great Recession, and that was something like $1.7 trillion at the highest level for one of the years during the Great Recession. So this was much more borrowing, much more spending than ever in the past. And of this spending, of that $9 trillion in spending, $3.8 trillion was on government goods and services and government investment. So it's about 42%. So this is what you traditionally think of as the government part of GDP. Government buys goods and services. Some of it's investment goods and services. Some of it's consumption goods and services. And of that $3.8 trillion in spending, more than half of it was by the state and local government. $1.5 trillion was by the federal government. But there was an additional $5.3 trillion in spending, and that was from transfer payments because of the pandemic primarily, but also transfer payments are very high anyway in the United States. So this is spending on things like Social Security, unemployment insurance, etc. Just transfer payments, subsidies, payment on existing U.S. debt. And this is not part of GDP. And then last, this is just what the pattern looks like of total government spending, which is the green line, total government revenues, which is the blue line. And you'll see that for the past 60 years, we've consistently outspent our revenues. And this is the level of borrowing. This red line are the continuing deficits that we've run. You notice there's only one period right here where revenue and spending matched. And we paid a little bit of our existing debt, but the rest of it was just borrowing. And this is like a rotating account. In other words, the level of debt has never gone down, except very small amount at this time period. So it's like having a loan that you don't pay any principal on. You're only just paying off the interest and carrying the principal for decades and decades. And that's the picture for the U.S. government. That's somewhat the picture for the world as well. Thank you.